Hello, my name is David Evans. I hope you're enjoying the Summer Institute. I wanted to give you a short introduction to an impact evaluation that I carried out over the last several years together with the Gambian government. First, I'll say something about the origin of the evaluation. Then, I'll share the setup and the results. And finally, I'll share a few lessons that we learned that may be useful in your own work. Back in 2007, the World Bank convened a workshop of education policymakers from across sub-Saharan Africa. I attended that workshop and I worked with the government team from the Gambia. Over the course of a week, we discussed the nature of impact evaluation and various methodologies. We also invited the government to review its portfolio of activities and identify any that were of particularly high value for them to learn from. The Gambian government identified a program called Whole School Development. I'll tell you more about that in a minute. They were investing a lot of resources in this program, and they really wanted to understand its effectiveness before continuing to invest resources at a large scale. Together, we identified that a cluster randomized trial would be the most effective methodology since the intervention took place at the school level. While student-level randomization can make sense for some interventions, an intervention that mostly interacts with school leadership or the school as a whole is most effectively implemented as a cluster randomized trial where we randomize at the school level. After this, we worked together for several years to implement this evaluation. What we examined in this evaluation is the relationship between parental human capital and effective school management. Now, as you can imagine, these impact evaluations require the participation and cooperation of a whole team. And so we worked with the Ministry of Basic and Secondary Education in the Gambia. We worked closely with BESPOR, which was the implementing agency who was putting whole school development in place on the ground. There was a team of researchers and operational staff at the World Bank. And further, there were other partners on the ground, such as the Gambia Bureau of Statistics, who helped us gather the data. Included two principal treatment arms. The first arm was the whole school development intervention, which provided schools with a manual about how to run a school, detailed training, which took place over the course of the year, and then a grant to get them started in improving the school. A second treatment arm provided just a school grant so that we could see and the government could see whether the manual and the training were actually doing anything more than just providing a little bit of money. The whole school development intervention trained school director, teachers, and parents in the community in improved school management practices. The training covered leadership and management, community participation, and several other areas. The intermediate goals were to involve teachers and parents more actively in school governments and to develop a plan, a school improvement plan. The ultimate outcome or goal was to improve student learning through school-specific improvement plans and some limited resources to implement those plans. Was very involved and engaging. There was a lot of visual stimuli as a lot of parents in the communities didn't have very strong literacy skills. The second intervention, the school grants, meant that the schools had to write a school development plan that included the activities that the grant would be used for. The grant was about $500 per school per year, and it was given once under this study. The size was determined by the size of the school, the hardship status, and it ultimately was about 5% of the total school budget, or 16 months' salary for a new teacher. The grants were intended to be used only on activities pertaining to teacher and learning. So the whole school development schools received a grant to go along with this school improvement plan that they developed. The grant-only schools also had the opportunity to prepare a plan, but without the training that the whole school development schools were receiving. So, this program was piloted in schools from Regions 2, 3, 4, and 6. Region 1 was excluded because it was very distinctive. Region 5 was excluded because it had already received whole school development in an initial pre-pilot proof of concept. Schools were randomly assigned but not at the school level, but in fact at clusters of schools. The implementing agency was very concerned that schools right next to each other might share information. And if you have a treatment and a comparison school right next to each other, sharing information about this whole school development program, then what's likely to happen is that the control school is contaminated because they learn all about this great program. And so what we did was we identified groups of schools, 2 to 3 schools that were relatively close together and most likely to share information, and we randomized those schools in clusters. The procedure started with all schools in 2, 3, 4, and 6 regions, and then those were grouped into 101 geographical groupings, and finally, we ultimately assigned them randomly to either whole school development, 90 schools, a school grant, 94 schools, and 89 schools that served as a comparison and didn't receive any program at all. Within the schools, we randomly selected classroom teachers and students to gather data. So this took place between late October 2007, when we started to provide sensitization and hold meetings with the government and with local government to make sure everyone understood the evaluation, the assignment of the intervention and baseline data collection in early 2008, the training and grant distribution in whole school development schools in May to December of 2008, follow-up data collection in June of 2009, grant distribution in grant-only schools also in 2009, and then 2 additional years of follow-up data collection. So in every round, we gathered school data, an interview with the head teacher, plus administrative records. We did classroom visits with some basic classroom observation and some student written literacy and numeracy tests with 40 students per school. We also did a student interview and an oral literacy test with 10 students per school. In a couple of rounds, we gathered additional data. For example, we gathered teacher content knowledge from about 5 teachers per school in 2010. Also, we did a parent interview with selected parents that year. In 2011, we did an interview with members of the school management committee. So at baseline, we examined what these schools looked like. About 89% of the buildings were in good condition. Students were seated on a chair and seated at a table. In about 97% of cases, there was clean sanitation in almost every school and safe drinking water. Student-teacher ratio was about 40. There were a lot of double shifts, which means you have one group of students in the morning and one in the afternoon. There was high absenteeism. 1 in 5 teachers were absent on the day of the surveys, and 1/3 of teachers had missed at least 1 day during the previous week. This will prove important later. Students were also highly absent. In 3 of the regions, 20% absenteeism. In 1 of the regions, that was nearly 40%. Finally, baseline learning was very poor. Students have to read about 45 words per minute in order to comprehend what they're reading. In fact, what we observed is that students in Class 3 or Grade 3 were reading 17 words per minute in Region 2 and much less in other regions. And even students in Class 5 or Grade 5 were only reading about 33 words per minute in Region 2 and lower speeds in other regions. Numeracy test likewise. With a simple arithmetic problem like 7 minus 2, barely more than 70% of students in grade 5 were able to carry out that, and much lower for very simple multiplication or division. So, given that there was clearly a need for improved educational interventions, one of the questions that we ask is, did randomization work? In other words, did the schools in the treatment and comparison groups look similar or identical from the outset at the baseline? So here we show some baseline data, and you can see in terms of school characteristics, the schools look very similar. The same number of students, the same student-teacher ratio, adult literacy in the communities based on the 2003 census, whether the teacher has a lesson note, which is some note they use to prepare their class. There's a slight difference in pupil absenteeism. It's slightly lower in the grant-only schools, and that's only significant at the 90% level, so we're not too concerned about that. In general, they look pretty similar. The students look very similar in terms of whether they ate breakfast that day, had a telephone home, at home, etc. There was a slight difference in terms of whether they have access to electricity at home, marginally significant at the 90% level. But when you look at the actual size of the difference, we're looking at 19% versus 21% in whole school development versus grant schools. So it's tough to argue that that's really driving some sort of impact we find later. In general, these schools look pretty balanced. So 6 months in, is the program working? So we do see that in whole school development schools, they've really formed committees. So there's a community participation committee, a curriculum management committee, a teacher professional development committee, exactly as the whole school development program prescribes. But we don't see other impacts. The PTA is still unfunded. There are few PTA fundraisers. And in some cases, there are records of teacher attendance, but these aren't different across the different treatment groups. 1 year later, we do see that teachers and parents are more likely to be involved in decision making in both the grant and whole school development schools. In terms of fundraisers and PTA meetings, we see a significant increase in fundraisers in whole school development schools, but not in grant-only schools. PTA meetings are significantly lower in the whole school development schools. This is probably because schools are holding a lot more of meetings of these subcommittees, like the Community Participation Committee, and so they're holding fewer overall parent-teacher association meetings. Some really strong additional impacts are in attendance or participation. So early on in 2008 and 2009, we don't see strong impacts. But as the program continues to gather steam, in 2011, we see that teacher absenteeism and student absenteeism are both significantly lower in the whole school development schools. We don't see any difference in the grant schools. Now, in terms of the teaching practices, we actually see some potential improvements in the whole school development schools, where teachers are slightly more likely to be calling students by name and using the blackboard. These effects aren't too strong, but it does suggest that potentially teaching practices are a little bit better. However, we don't see anything on test scores. So in 2009, 2010, 2011, we look at test scores for whole school development schools, grant schools, and comparison schools, and we just see no differences. The group with the most exposure, 6th graders in 2011 who've had 3 full years of being in a whole school development school, relative to control schools, well, you can see the table. There's just no significant difference. We see very little impact of the grants. Why not? Well, you can see that a lot of schools did use the grant for teaching and learning materials, including stationery, but many also used it for infrastructure, for holding some sort of workshop. Some of these items which we might not expect to have a direct impact on improving student learning. So why would we see these impacts on student absenteeism but not on student learning? So students are going to school more, teachers are attending school more, but the students don't seem to be learning more. So there are a few hypotheses. One is that there's improvement in the control schools. They were getting better at the same time. Well, we examine that and we just don't see any evidence of it. A second hypothesis is that when whole school development was implemented, poor children in the community who had already dropped out of school came back to school to participate in this exciting program, and that dragged down the test scores in the whole school development schools. Well, we examine that as well, and we do see a few more low-performing students in the whole school development schools. But when we just look at the students who were able to track from the very beginning of the evaluation to the end, those students for whom we shouldn't see an effect of additional students coming in, we see no difference still between the whole school development and the comparison schools. So it doesn't seem like it's hypothesis 2. Hypothesis 3 is that maybe teacher quality is extremely low, so a little bit of additional attendance at school doesn't make any difference because the teacher isn't effective at teaching. We gave teachers a test in the 3rd year of the evaluation to examine whether or not the teachers actually had capacity. And in fact, the teachers performed very poorly on the content test. And so it does seem like this could have a partial impact in explaining why students aren't learning despite coming to school more. A fourth hypothesis is that this program isn't improving the right management practices. So Nick Bloom at Stanford University and others have examined school management practices and found correlations between certain school management practices and student performance. But when we look at the correlation between those school management practices and the whole school development intervention, we don't see much of a correlation. And so it could be that the whole school development intervention isn't actually working and improving the right school management practices. So a final hypothesis is that this intervention only works in some cases. Regression, and we interact the whole school development or the grant intervention with the level of adult literacy in the specific district, what we can see is that in areas with higher levels of adult literacy, there even is a significant impact on student learning. If you look at the first row of the table, the math and English scores, the grant program, the grant-only program in the second row still doesn't have any significant impact. So what this suggests is that in fact, in communities where there's sufficient parent literacy to participate actively in running the school effectively, you actually can see an improvement in student performance as a result of the whole school development program. So there are clear impacts of whole school development on participation, and there are potential impacts on learning in communities with higher human capital, in general where adult literacy exceeds about 45%. In low-capacity communities, whole school development could even have a potential negative impact. In general, we see that parents and caregivers are very satisfied with the performance of the school. People report high levels of satisfaction. It could be that, in fact, low literacy parents don't have the capacity to effectively evaluate the school. And so by taking decision-making power away from the school director and putting it in the hands of the parents, the school actually gets run a little bit less effectively. In addition to these results, I just wanted to share one lesson that we learned. Our decision to test the teachers was not part of our original evaluation plan, but partway through the evaluation, the Permanent Secretary for Education in the Gambia expressed to me, he said, "I think one of the real problems we have here is that teachers don't know the content they're supposed to be teaching. We were about to mount a new round of data collection, and so I said, we can test that." And so not only were we able to feed into the impact evaluation some information about the quality of teacher knowledge, in fact, when we incorporated this into the 2010 follow-up survey, a test of teacher knowledge, it demonstrated these massive gaps in teacher knowledge and contributed to the overall Gambia's plans for in-service training programs. This is one of several examples wherein the impact evaluation was able to inform not just the results of this evaluation, but also to affect policy more broadly. It does seem to improve elements of school management, and it does seem to improve learning where community literacy is higher. Given limited impacts on average, it's likely too costly to sustain and replicate. What the Gambian government has done is extracted key elements of whole school development and integrated those elements into a more cost-effective intervention. One-time grants seem to have little effectiveness. It would be interesting to evaluate multi-year grants, maybe improved calibration of the grants to school size, and improve the flexibility so that schools can speed up the disbursement. Thank you very much, and I wish you well in your ongoing study.